As you may already know from reading the description and why you chose to come here, I go by Mr. Soul, Rick Campanella, if you want to look me up on Facebook or something like that. But I started the company Brothers Grimm Seeds back in the late 90s, around 97. And during that early part of the company's development, I created Cinderella 99, which if you think about it today, it's 20 years anniversary, being 2019 now. So that has stood the test of time for 20 years as a strain that people could count on for a reliable result from a pack of seeds. What I was describing informally a moment ago, you buy a pack of seeds, you'd like to think that all the plants that come out of it are going to live up to the expectations of the description on the pack, So that was one of the things that was not very available at the time back then. We're going back 20 years. Things have advanced a lot since then, obviously, in the world of cannabis. But what I was trying to do back then was, most of us were really into the sativa smoke, the kind of high that you get from a sativa where it's energetic and you don't feel lethargic. And the disadvantage of growing that kind of plant was it takes a long time to finish, 14 to 16 weeks most of the time. At that time, if you were going to grow a real sativa, and the yield was rather low. After waiting all that time, you don't even have a lot of this fantastic weed. So my idea was to try to breed a strain where you could grow in a shorter amount of time with a higher yield and still get that flavor and high. And that's what Cinderella 99 was developed for and was successful in doing. So that's kind of my claim to fame. And someone could say, well, 20 years ago you did that. What have you done lately? And just to sort of fast forward to the present, it's a fair question, right? I did hit the list of the top 10 strains of 2018 last year in the December issue of High Times magazine with a new strain I call Rosetta Stone. And I'm really proud of that. And it's kind of like being an artist, where you ask an artist, what's your favorite piece of art that you've ever done? And it's always the last one I did, right? So I feel that way about Rosetta, and I would hope that people will try that. But enough about me, and I'm here to discuss, obviously, feminized seeds. And it's a controversial subject, and that's what makes it interesting, and it's a good draw for people who come to these events. Mainly because in the minds of the people who are in this industry or starting to get into it, you're confused about it, or you hear a lot of conflicting advice about it, am I right? So it's like, there are those who will strongly say, oh, never, 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 don't touch the feminized seeds. You're just going to end up with hermaphrodites and so on. And there's a good reason for that, which we'll come to in the presentation. So dispelling those old wives' tales and clarifying the science behind feminized seeds when done right as opposed to done wrong is what this is going to be all about. And I'd like to start from a point where I don't assume that you're experts already and know a lot of nuanced information about cannabis, because I've given this explanation informally at cocktail parties and with friends and so on. And sometimes I'll reach the end of explaining this very complicated, detailed methodology of creating feminized seeds, and then they'll say, but why do you want to grow a female plant? Like, oh my God, I have to rewind all the way back to, you didn't know that? So that's where I like to start. So why do we want female plants, right? Why do we want to grow female cannabis? Well, it's because female plants, they grow the buds, right, that we want. Have you ever seen a male plant? Compared to a female plant, a male plant, it's essentially worthless as marijuana. I mean, there's virtually no mass, no biomass to sell. And what is there is very low in terms of, see, compared to this is what you want, buds, right? This is why we grow female cannabis. And then if you look at a male, it's basically skimpy, wimpy, very little of anything there to give you anything. So this is the male flower, what it looks like, the actual part of the plant that gives the pollen that you see falling there on the leaves. And then if we go back to the female, you'll notice that it's constructed of a much tighter pattern, structure of what are called calyxes and pistils that are filling in all these gaps as you go from the bottom to the top of the plant. And those are the buds that we dry and cure and trim and sell and process into either concentrates or just selling the straight flower. So that's The reason why we grow the female for the output that it gives us is the correct output. And then what's wrong with having any males around, you might ask, Well, if you have a male in the group of your females while they're flowering, what's going to happen? The male plant will release pollen, and then the pollen will pollinate the females, and they'll grow seeds. Well, next logical question after that is, what's wrong with having seeds in my crop? Right? Well, how do we buy marijuana? By what quantity? Weight, right? So seeds weigh something, right? So you're buying the cannabis and you're paying by weight, and you can't smoke the seeds, but you paid for them. And it degrades the quality of the marijuana. So now that we've kind of cleared the question of which type of cannabis we're growing and why, I want to step into, okay, you're starting to talk about males and females in a very, assuming way, presuming that we all know, what's the difference and what really defines that. And I want to drill down just a bit more on what makes us all males and females in the first place. We all get half of our genes from our mother and half from our father, right? And one of the main chromosomes that genes are, a chromosome is made up of a multiplicity of genes. So a chromosome is a bigger structure than a gene. So it's really very strongly responsible for the quality that chromosome carries into the organism. And like, for example, we have 42 chromosomes, and cannabis has 10 from each parent. So now the X and the Y chromosome are the sex chromosomes, right? And if you're a female, you've inherited an X chromosome from your father when he pollinated your mom. I'm using plant language now. And your mom had the X to start with because females only have X's, right? So when you think about it, everybody inherits the X chromosome, or at least one of them if you're a female, from your mom. And that's what I'm trying to say in the second line here. So a female in any union with pollen will only contribute an X chromosome, and the father can contribute either an X or a Y chromosome if the plant was a male plant. So that's how we differentiate in the cannabis world between a male and a female. The male is the XY chromosome, and the female is the XX chromosome. So you may have heard about hermaphrodites, right? And that's one of the reasons why people will dissuade you from using feminized seeds is the risk of hermaphrodites. And a hermaphrodite is one, by definition, that makes both male and female flowers on the same plant, right? And that's a bad thing because even worse than a male that can ruin your crop, at least with a male, you kind of know what you're looking for and you can say, oh, there's a male, let's get that out of here. And you can generally recognize them well before they've caused a problem if you're actually looking. So the worst thing to have is a hermaphrodite because they really look like a female, and then suddenly at a time when you didn't realize it was going to happen, boom, they start making pollen, male flowers start forming on them. And if you're not really carefully looking at every plant and watching for that sort of thing, it can easily get away from you. And so you can imagine in a commercial growing facility, who's going to have the time to go through thousands of plants constantly with a little loop looking for signs of a male plant showing up or a hermaphrodite flower on what they thought was a female plant. So I'm just trying to emphasize here how bad it is to have a hermaphrodite. And remember we were just talking about, okay, what makes a boy and what makes a girl? XX is a girl, right? And XY is a male. So it would be almost logical, would be logical really, to think that, well, maybe a hermaphrodite is something else that's not an X and a Y or an X and an X. But that would be highly unusual to find a hermaphrodite in the population if that were true, right? Because you're dealing with X's and Y's in one group, the males, and X's in the females. And where are you going to get some bastardized combination to come from would be highly statistically unlikely. And when you think about the occurrence of hermaphrodites in cannabis world, they happen pretty often, don't they? It's not something where you think like, oh, astronomical odds, it only happens once in a rare moon. They're far too common for some other arrangement of X and Y chromosome to have been the reason for the hermaphrodite. So it turns out, and I've done research in scientific journals, and you can look all this kind of stuff up, but, and I'll also give you an anecdote right now that'll help you understand. It turns out that the cause of hermaphroditism is hormonal, not chromosomal. So they like us, a hermaphrodite has two X chromosomes or XY chromosome, whether it's a boy who's tending toward a girl or a girl who's tending toward a boy, which is much more common because we pointed out early in this discussion that we're growing girls, right? So most of our hermaphrodites are going to be XX chromosomes, but the hormones are causing it to shift gender and create flowers on a female that are male flowers. And so we'll just review the definition of hermaphroditism in cannabis is the expression of both male and female flowers as a reaction to stress or simply as part of its normal growth pattern, right? Because we're considering now plants that we didn't do anything special to them other than maybe the normal stresses of life that we all live with, right? We understand the difference between genotype and phenotype. Genotype is what's coded into your DNA and what the recipe for you is at its very basic level. And then the environment starts to either augment those or reduce those traits that we might have in an ideal environment, okay? So just like us and a plant will, through its life, either be subjected to stress or it's just coded into its genes that this plant has that tendency to make male flowers on a female plant, okay? So that's what you should think of when I say a hermaphrodite. It's a plant that will, through either stress or simply as part of its normal growth, make male flowers on a female plant. And it's genetic in origin. It's not to say that this is a hormonal thing, has nothing to do with your genes, just that it isn't the sex gene, it isn't the sex chromosome arrangement of the X's and the Y's that is causing this, okay? But you still do inherit that tendency for hermaphroditism from the parents. And we see that in the populations of cannabis that are out there now. So how can you tell if a plant that seems to be female is really just a hermaphrodite? And so this is kind of reinforcing, people are hearing this for the first time, and I take a lot of this for granted, so I try to double this up and repeat myself. But if a female cannabis plant reacts to stress by growing male flowers, it's a hermaphrodite. And if a female plant never grows male flowers despite being stressed, it doesn't have the gene for hermaphroditism, so we can call it a true female, okay? And we all must have seen at least one example of this, or you would have never seen a successful cannabis grow because it got all the way to the end and no seeds were created and you grew sinsemilla. So those females, at least under the stress conditions that they were living under, didn't hermy on you, right? So I wouldn't say it's definitely a true female because maybe the environment was just so perfect and it didn't receive enough stress to make it hermy. But if you did want to test, which you should do if you're going to make fem seeds, what you need to do is take the parental stock that you're thinking about making the seeds from. In other words, the two females that you plan on crossing. Make sure that all of these different things don't affect them, like inconsistent light schedules or extended flowering time, excess or extreme changes in temperature, letting the plant become root bound, messing with the pH, the spectrum of the light, wet and dry conditions, over/under feeding. But the first one is the first one for a reason, because this is the first one where you would most likely ferret out your hermaphrodite by messing with the light schedule, having them in 12-12 for a while, flipping the lights to 24 hours, and then go back to 12-12, messing with that, because remember, what causes the plant to flower in the first place? The photoperiod, right? So when a plant's outdoors and it starts sensing the days are getting shorter, it's going into flowering in anticipation of autumn coming and the cold weather, and it's going to have to make seeds for the next season because it's going to die, right? So those changes in light schedule are related to flowering so tightly that you could imagine that messing with the light schedule is the first thing that's going to show you've got a hermy. And so I want to, for the next point that I'm going to make, talk about the male plant and when it releases pollen. When a male plant releases pollen, it has both X and Y chromosomes, remember? So When the sperm cells from a male human being, flow, they are essentially millions or even billions in number. So that's a statistically significant number. Like 5 or 10 of something doesn't prove anything, right? I mean, statistically, to have a statistically significant number, it needs to be a big number. So on average, with those kinds of numbers, the sperm or pollen, in the case of a plant, will have about a 50-50 mixture of X chromosomes in the pollen or Y chromosomes in the pollen, right? So each one of those tiny grains of pollen from the male's flower carries either an X or a Y chromosome, as I just said, and a cloud of that pollen would be considered like a 50% X and Y chromosomes that are now creating this cloud of pollen in a room where there's all these receptive female flowers waiting to be pollinated. And you're going to get about 50-50 male and female seeds. That's what people refer to as, those are regular seeds. That's how regular seeds are made. And so then you'll get the 50-50 ratio. And so now, having the standard way of making seeds in mind, what's different? How do we make them female, right? And the most important thing, remember, is that we make sure that they're all going to be really female seeds and that they won't produce a hermaphrodite. And now, I just said that, we need to breed with only the stress-resistant true females because they won't pass on the Hermy gene. Because if you think about it, right, if you breed with any trait, it's the old rule in Mendel's genetics is that like begets like. And so if you want a certain trait to be present in the progeny, you look for that in both parents so that they're both going to be contributing to that. So you'll always run the risk of a hermaphrodite if one of the parents, either the one who's receiving the pollen, right, because that's half the genetics, and the one who's donating the pollen, they both have to be Hermy-resistant females. So we're going to make pollen from a female. Now let's talk about how we do that. So this slide seems to be a little jogged, but I'm sorry about that. Remember that the stress induces a hormonal reaction, right, resulting in male flowers, and that creates some hermaphrodite. But it's actually the hormones that are causing the female plant to make the male flowers, not the stress. Let me pause on that for a second so you can all understand that there's a difference between a plant that, when stressed, has a hormonal reaction to the stress and makes male flowers, because that's a genetic thing that you don't want passed on to the next generation. But remember, we talked about finding a true female that doesn't do that in nature. And then what would we do then to get pollen out of such a plant? Because it doesn't react to stress by making pollen. And by the way, I'll sort of go off on a little bit of a tangent there. That remember, we were talking about early feminized seeds having a bad reputation for producing hermaphrodites. Well, that was because the guys at that time didn't understand the distinction that we're making here right now, that there are some that will do it normally by stress, as a reaction to stress, or one that won't do it as a reaction to stress. And of course, they didn't know how to get pollen from a plant that didn't do this just as a reaction to stress at that time. So pretty much 100% of all the feminized seeds made in the early days were made from hermaphrodite pollen. So is it any surprise that they got a bad reputation, right? So here's how you do it right. This is the meat of what we're talking about now. So a true female plant can be hormonally induced to make male flowers, even though they don't do that naturally. This is what you're looking for. These are the kinds of females that you want to breed with, the ones that don't react to stress and go Hermy on you. So you get yourself a true female plant that you've tested by messing with the light cycles or just having grown it for long enough that you know that this one never Hermies. And you spray that true female plant with what's called silver thiosulfate, and she'll grow male flowers because you're blocking the female hormone ethylene, which is analogous to estrogen in women. And if you've ever, I'm sure all of us in the 21st century, for heaven's sakes, we watched our social media and see reality TV and things like that. And we know that there are people out there who feel like they're a man born in a woman's body or vice versa. And what do those folks do to start to shift themselves to look more like what they feel like inside? They take hormones, right? So we know that hormones will shift the expression of maleness or femaleness in an organism. So that's what we're going to take advantage of. By using the silver thiosulfate spray on the plant, it will block the ethylene being absorbed or produced, and then the hormone that's left will they'll only be able to make male flowers. But what's different about the male flowers of a female? Like if we force that female to make male flowers, she doesn't have any Y chromosome in her genetic makeup, right? In the DNA of a female, we've already established they only have X chromosomes. So if we take a female and induce her through hormones to make male flowers, that female plant can only carry X chromosomes because females only have X chromosomes in the first place, right? So without a Y chromosome, remember that cloud of pollen we were talking about before where it was like 50% X's and Y's? Imagine them like in your imagination floating around the room. Now you've got a room where there's only X's floating around and that's all that's in there. There's no Y's. So all you're going to get then are female plants, right? Because the female flower that's sitting there waiting for the pollen has X chromosomes, right? Every female flower carries an X chromosome. And every grain of female pollen is going to carry an X chromosome too. So you get female pollen plus female flower, you're going to get XX seeds. There's no other way around it. So if ever somebody says to you, oh no, I've heard that you can get a male from feminized seeds, and maybe some of you have heard that, right? What do you think happened in that case? What error did that person make in assuming that they got a male from feminized seeds? Two things could be at play there. Either they're mistaking a hermaphrodite as a male, right? And if you see any female flowers on it, then I would say, that's not a male, that's a hermaphrodite. But many people aren't that schooled. And then the other big mistake that could be made is on the end of the breeder. It's not so much the person interpreting the plant that they're looking at and recognizing or misrecognizing a plant as being a male when it's really a hermaphrodite. The other thing that could happen is, and remember we were talking earlier about how cannabis growing and breeding and the development during the Dark Ages or Prohibition, people weren't that open about what they were doing. They had to be completely secretive about it, in fact, and we all lived kind of underground. So with those conditions, you're not allowed to have a lot of space to grow in, or you don't typically have the rigor of a scientific lab to make sure that everything's clean and perfect. So what other error could be made is on the breeder's side, where he bred regular seeds in his facility at one time, didn't clean well enough, brought in new plants, tried to breed a fem strain, and there's still some remaining Y pollen floating around in the room or on a shelf that got blown off of at the last minute. Nobody noticed. So that would be the only way you're going to get an actual true male from what were supposed to be feminized seeds, is sloppy breeding or poor cleanliness conditions in the room where they were bred. And we won't have hermaphrodites. Why? Because as long as both the parents were stress-resistant true females, you won't have hermaphrodites, and for the reason that I just went over in detail, you won't have males either. And I'd like to pause on this subject just for a second. I don't like the name feminized. You know why? Because I might be a stickler for the language and the connotations of words and so on, but feminized gives the connotation that you had some regular seeds and you pulled out some magic wand and changed what would have been normal regular seeds into female seeds. That's not what we did, is it? When you think about the process of what we just described, how feminized seeds are created, I prefer to just call them female seeds because we didn't feminize them, we just created them as female in the first place, right? Because all we really did, imagine if we could do this. You have a male releasing pollen into a room full of females, but before that pollen can get to the females, there's a filter that stops all of the Y chromosomes, because maybe we figured out this right size mesh in this filter that Y chromosomes are larger and they just get stuck, right? And only the female ones get through. Now, if we were to do that, right, and let all those X chromosome pollen pollinate those females, they'd all make female seeds, wouldn't they? Okay. So when you think about it, this is another really important point that I want to make before we finish. There's no difference between a female that's grown from a female seed than from regular seeds, right? Because the only thing that really defines a female is 2 X chromosomes. And all we've done to make these seeds is ensure that the pollen that touches the female is X. So I like to use the analogy if there was a family that lived down the street from you and the mother and father had nothing but girls, right? Would they be any different as, female human beings than the other family that lived down the street and they had 2 boys and 2 girls? Are those girls from the family where they had brothers different than the girls that were born into a family of only girls? No. So don't ever listen to somebody saying to you, oh, no, a female that was grown from feminized seed is somehow genetically different than one that had been grown from a regular seed that just happened to have, a female. So it's 2 X chromosomes coming together and making a seed that will produce a female. So there's really a lot of misinformation out there, which is one of the reasons I do these things, is to try to dispel all of those old wives' tales that came from the development of our industry from having been like a black market or gray market underground thing. This is the subject I was just talking about, I'm sorry. So it's just a female. And the things that people will say about a feminized female that you can't do is clone it. Like they say they won't root. It's absolute nonsense. It takes about 10 days to prove that wrong, right? You start with a feminized plant, say, let me take a branch off of this thing, bring it in the other room here, put it in a cloner and see if it'll root. Sure enough, they do. So they're wrong, obviously on that point. And then for many other reasons, they'll say that, well, you can't breed with them, can you? And like, what if you then took a plant that came from fem seed and you reversed another female and crossed it to it? Would there be any problem with that? Well, no, because it keeps coming back to the fact that there's no difference between a female that came from a female seed or a regular seed. And that I'll give you something that somebody threw at me not too long ago where they said, well, you're saying there's no difference, but I've got you now because remember when I was talking about what if all of the pollen that were going into the room were filtered and only the X chromosome pollen got through? And in this case, we're letting pollen from a female be created and that only has X chromosomes in it. What's the difference? This person thought they were really cute, like, oh, I've got you, Mr. Soul. That pollen grain came from a male, whereas that other pollen grain came from a female. So aren't they different? And I say, well, where did the male that contributed that pollen grain that had the X chromosome in it get his X chromosome in the first place? From his mother. Yeah. So all X chromosomes come from a female originally anyway. The male inherited it from his mom, and the female already had it from herself and her father or mother, in this case. So the point being, there's no difference between a pollen grain that carries an X chromosome, whether it came from a male or a female. And then what about breeding with females? This is a really interesting subject. Now that you all understand how to properly produce a feminized seed, you now can think about, well, what are the advantages of making seeds with 2 females over making them with a male and a female? This is huge because if you think about it, all these years that we've been breeding with males and females, the male is 50% of the contribution of genes to the next generation. But when you look at a male, can you tell anything about the kinds of female qualities that male might pass on to his daughters? Because remember, all we care about are the daughters. So the measure of a male's quality is the quality of his daughters. And how do you even know how good a male is until he's gone through at least 1 generation of producing daughters, and then you can say, aha, because I've crossed this male to 3 different females or a dozen different females, I'm seeing a sort of common denominator effect that male had across the board with all of these females. All of their children inherited, whatever additional female qualities that he may be responsible for contributing. And that's a lot of work. And remember how I was just saying a moment ago how the breeders in the Dark Ages, we really didn't have a lot of space to work with and we had to keep everything quiet and secret. So how likely is it that we'd be doing that right, where we grow enough males and do enough test crosses and then evaluate them, and finally, and all that time you're keeping the male alive, and so it doesn't die and flower out. highly unlikely that anybody's going to do that with enough rigor to really drill down and determine what were the female qualities that that male had that passed on to his genes. Now consider the other way around where you're working with two females, right? I see the female qualities of the one parent and I see the female qualities of the other parent, and the combining of those genes, remember like begets like, you're crossing two short flowering females with heavy resin production and a certain kind of aroma that you feel you want to propagate into the next generation. You're much more likely to get the result that you're looking for right away when you're crossing two females, because you're seeing the female qualities that both parents are contributing to the union instead of guessing at one and knowing the other one, right? So it's really important to consider that as another advantage to working with female seeds. So I know I sometimes run ahead of my slide, but we'll just kind of, so you can see it written in front of you. We're breeding for female traits like resin production and flower structure, and a male cannabis plant doesn't express any female traits because by definition, he's a male. It's like looking for, you'll excuse the vulgarity of what I suggest here, but in human terms, if you wanted to create women with beautiful vaginas, how would you pick the proper husband for the woman who has the beautiful vagina that you'd like her daughter to inherit? He may mess it all up, right? And you can't look at him and see what kind of vagina he has that he might pass on to his daughter, right? So we're dealing with that exact same thing right here. So he doesn't have the female traits we're looking for to be able to judge him by looks. So all that extra work of test crossing and growing out the progeny and figuring out the common denominator, and then you might find he was worthless in the first place, and I spent 2 years trying to figure that out. So properly choosing a male cannabis for breeding is a huge challenge. It's the only measure of a male is his female offspring when you come down to it. And so with all the tedium that's involved and multi-generational projects, most breeders would just guess, and I've seen so many posts where like, look at this amazing male, right? You must have seen these posts on Instagram, and they'll be like, look at this stud of a male. Why? What female qualities are you seeing in this male that you're judging it by? It's just that it's all neutral qualities like vigor, large size, big branches. Oh, sure, but those are all things that, are common to both male and females. What kind of female genetics is he going to contribute? You don't know. So it's important that we don't just guess about that. And so by combining the genes of two females, we can really better predict the outcome. So I feel that that's another untapped advantage that nobody talks about, and I like to get that out and make sure you understand. Now, I covered this before. Why do they have a bad reputation? Because essentially, those original guys, they were breeding with hermaphrodites because they didn't know that just, getting the pollen from the female, it's important to not get it by stress, but only to get it from females that don't react to stress by becoming hermaphrodites, but rather using a stronger tool like hormones to force it. And so it's no surprise that they were trying to make feminized seeds, but they produce more hermaphrodites, and then, they're as despised as they were misunderstood. But now, having listened to all of the science behind how it's done right, we know better, and we're always there as Brothers Grimm Seeds to provide for folks who do want to ensure that they're getting plants that will all be female from the seeds that they buy. And seeds are, if you're not really aware of it or you haven't thought deeply about it, it's probably the biggest bang for your buck of anything that you're going to buy if you're growing cannabis, right? Because for $100 or so, you can get a pack of seeds that one great female that comes out of that could start a perpetual money generator for you where you'll never have to buy another seed, and you'll have a high quality source of clones that you can then fill room after room with identical plants that all have the same wonderful qualities once you found this one that you love, or maybe you have several like that. So never go cheap on seeds. My seeds aren't expensive. Not that I'm saying that they're expensive, but I did have the experience of seeing some commercial buyers in the last year where they're looking to buy thousands of seeds at a time, and they want fem seeds because they plan to plant them all and not worry about males. Now, if you're planning on doing that and you know the potential hazards of pollinating and seeding out your crop, Would you try to save 25 cents a seed or $1 a seed even? You know, like as inexpensive as they are, seeds at that level, when you're buying thousands at a time, you're gonna pay maybe a couple of bucks a seed. So what if you had bought clones? How much would somebody charge if each one of them was a female clone? At least 10 times that, right? So seeds are a really good deal. And it's also the one thing that everything else you're going to do from that time forward, it depends upon, right? If you started out with mediocre seeds and you gave them even the most amazing, perfect environment, what are you going to get? Mediocre resulting plants, right? But if you start with an outstanding genetic and you give it even an average environment, you're going to get a very acceptable, if not outstanding result, right? And imagine if you gave it the perfect environment. So I advocate that people realize that money invested in your seeds at first is going to save you money later and give you a much better result, even if you make a few boo-boos along the way, right? So I'll end on that, and I appreciate you all coming. And there's questions, so there's time here at least for another few minutes. Please, sir.
So are you saying that good breeders should be able to guarantee 100% females?
I do, yes.
A lot of people I've seen it 90%. So if I got, so let's just say I got...
I've seen 99.9%, yeah.
I should never call that breeder again because he should have been able to...
He made a mistake. Should be able to, yes. So I feel that, this gentleman has pointed out that there are breeders who will advertise their fem seeds and say that there's 99% guaranteed female or something like that. Why do you think that they would throw out a number like that? Because it's so close to 100, but then just in case somebody gets, a few males, because I might be sure I really did this right, that gives them some wiggle room to get out from under, like, hey, dude, these were supposed to be all female and I got a few males. Well, I did say 99%. There's going to be perhaps one or two, right? That to me sounds like a weak breeder's way out. And, I'm standing firmly on now a couple of years straight. Since 2016, I've been producing fem seeds, and I haven't had people come back to me and say, we had a problem, Instead, I'm selling tens of thousands of seeds to commercial growers, and they're showing me rooms bigger than this room here, full of the seedlings filling the room, and they're very uniform and all female, and they're very happy. So I'll cross my fingers and hope that I never have to say they're 99% female,
I should expect 100%.
You should, yeah, if they're done right. Yeah, for all the reasons that I just tried to make very clear in the demonstration here. Yes, sir. Checkered shirt. Oh, here's a very important that you learn this, because you can mess that up too. If you're going to do this yourself, the right way to do it is to take the silver thiosulfate spray and spray on the first day of flowering. Because if you think about it, there have been people who say, well, I've been spraying it for like 5 weeks leading up to flowering, and then I'm not seeing anything happening when they go into flowering. They're not reversing. Well, yeah, because remember, the photo period is what triggers the plant to be flowering. And if it's in a vegetative state, it's not thinking about flowering. So all the hormones you're putting on it's not going to have any effect, right? So first day of flowering, when you flip the lights to 12-12, is the first day you should spray. And then every other day up until the 14th day. So that'd be like a total of 7 or 8 times that you've sprayed the plant. Stop doing it at that point, and then within a week or two, you'll see multiple male flowers forming, and from about 30 days, or right around the 30th day of flowering, if you did that, you should start seeing pollen being released in the room. And then I'll touch on that because I use the word see pollen. You don't really see the pollen. When you're making feminized seeds, the flowers that are created on a female, they don't open and release tons of pollen as much as a male would. So this is important that if you're ever doing this, the way I do it is I'll have what I call pollen donor female in the room 1 week before the other females that are going to be pollinated to make the seeds come in, okay? And why do I do that? Because I know that unlike a male, this reversed female is going to take a little longer to make the flowers. And even when they do come out, they're going to release pollen at a much slower and less voluminous rate than a male would. So what's the solution to you're not getting one big burst of pollen that completely fills the room and pollinates all the females at once? like a male would do. What you do to counteract that with females is you leave the pollen donor in the room for like 10 days after you see it starting to have an effect on the other plants. You'll see the flowers will open. You'll see that the little stamen are desiccated and dried, and you'll think like, well, pollen had to have fallen out of there. I just didn't see any, and it is microscopically small. You won't necessarily see it with your own eye unless it's in huge quantities like the way the male makes it. So what I do is leave one plant, if it's a small room, one pollen donor. If it's a really big room, I'll put pollen donors in different places in the room so to make sure that the air circulation will get that little bit of pollen that's coming out of them. It's released in less quantity and slower, so you kind of have to, it's like a timed release effect, okay? The longer you leave it in there, the more the other plants will be pollinated, and some will be pollinated earlier and some will be pollinated a little later. So your seeds are also going to come out where, oh, I've got some that are completely ripe, and this one needs another week on the same plant. So you just go by the ones that are the least developed, because you can't let them go too long. The seed's not going to somehow not be good because you let it stay on the plant longer, right? So that's a very good point you made there, because it's different the way that the female pollen is released in the room, and you have to plan accordingly. Good question. And the schedule of spraying with the STS is important too, because I've done experiments where people who were well-meaning and I thought were well-informed said, oh, you're overdoing it. You can just spray them on the first day and then, never again, and the whole same thing will happen. So I said, all right, let me try that. Here we are 2 weeks into this. I'm not seeing the effects that I normally see, but I'll give this guy a chance. And the whole flowering cycle goes by, and around the 30th day, I saw a few little male flowers pop up here and there, but nowhere near enough to be a breeder and actually make enough pollen in the room to make enough seeds to sell. So I said, okay, clearly that didn't work, and I went back on my contrasting experiment to say, okay, well, let's do it the way I do it on the same exact female, the clone of, and within 14 days, it was what I call balling up. The flowers were looking like little balls, like little footballs, and then within another week, they were starting to open, and then another week they were releasing pollen. And so my method of spraying them on the first day and then every other day thereafter to the 14th day of flowering, I can guarantee that works. I've tried other people's ideas and they didn't work.
Try forcing it, like beating a plant over it, and like each one maybe speed things up.
To beat the plant?
Not beat it, but shake it over.
Oh, yes.
The plant.
Yep. So the gentleman's correct that while the plant's sitting there, wind agitating the plant will knock pollen out into the air and spread it around, but walking up to the plant and tapping it with a stick or, just shaking it, don't shake it so much that you're breaking branches off of it or anything, beating it up or anything. But yes, if you only wanted to limit the pollen to a little bit, you could take a branch from a reversed female and walk over and kind of like wave it around and rub it on the female flowers of one plant and then get the hell out of Dodge, right? And then you'll know that there's so little pollen in this room that one plant that I touched physically with the branch is probably going to be the only one that makes any seeds in here. And if you get a few extra, you're going to get a few extra, but you can do that, yep. But I tend to want to saturate the whole room with seed. Yes, sir. I tend to be like, well, it's important that this thing makes pollen, and so I tend not to go to like the dilution that's recommended in the instructions that you'll probably have seen, the one where it says make it a 1:9 ratio. I generally do it like a 1:3. So it's like a third strength or a quarter strength, and that works for me. The gentleman at the back in the sports jacket, he had a question there. Is that true, sir? Yeah.
So, if we are talking about the outdoor environment versus indoor environment.
Indoor and outdoor environments can make a huge difference. I had a female from a strain that I created last year that we ran a whole group of them, and some of them hermied, and I obviously shut that project down, but there was one plant in the room that didn't, and I thought, well, I have a clone of it in the other room, and rather than just chop it down, let me throw it outdoors. I live in Colorado. I have a big space where I could just put this one plant out and just watch what happens this year. And you wouldn't believe the structure on the plant just from the fact that it's out in full sun. This plant that indoors had nice buds, and it was a good yielder, but there'd be space between each bud cluster on a branch like you see in a lot of cannabis plants. Outdoors, it looks like a woolly mammoth, just like these huge branches, just so densely populated with bud sites and so tightly clustered together, doesn't even resemble the plant that it was indoors. So you can get like wildly different results if you have something outdoors versus indoors. I think that was what your question was about, right? So it's like genotype and phenotype. The genotype was the same in both cases. Indoors, the little DNA recipe in the cells of the organism are telling it, these are your traits given the right environmental conditions, but some of them weren't being met indoors, but where outdoors they totally were, and then it really grew to its full potential. For me, the question sounds like you're saying better to breed indoors or outdoors? Indoors, because you got to control the environment very carefully and be scrupulously clean. Otherwise, you can introduce errors like we were talking about earlier. The guy who, he bred regular seeds in the facility last month, but now he wants to breed regular seeds in the same facility the next month. Too much of a risk that there's still some male pollen floating around that's still viable that might pollute the next breeding. So for that reason, I breed indoors, and I recommend only breeding indoors. But outdoors, you'd have to have some pretty special conditions to ensure that there's no wild pollen or undesirable pollen pollinating the females that you wanted to pollinate with the desirable male or reversed female, whichever it is that you're working with. But I would say closing off the space tightly to avoid any contamination is important. And that's the reason I'd say breed indoors, grow outdoors. Clorox, you just bleach up, bleach out the room and set off a bomb. Like pyrethrins is pretty mild for plants and humans, but it'll kill all the mites in the room and then start over. But I've experimented recently, I know we're going off topic a little bit, the predator mites that they sell work really well for killing the spider mites that we have as pests in our grow rooms. And I introduced some predator mites in one room a couple months ago, and I was surprised that within like 2 weeks, I'm looking at all the plants and I don't see any more spider mite bites. They're all just nice and clean and green. So that's a great way to not have to use any chemicals. Yes, sir. That's the idea. Yeah, like during in my case, I'm lucky enough to have been working with some of the same clones for about 20 years. And, that's enough time where you got to figure they've been subjected to everything by then. And if they've never hermied, they're not going to. So that was, for me, the ones that I've worked with. But more recently, if I get a plant like, say, I want to breed with Gorilla Glue or something like that, and picking a name, I would want to watch that plant for some time and subject it to different light cycles and test that it doesn't hermy, and then grow a cross from it. And then anytime I do grow crosses, by the way, when I sell seeds, they've been tested pretty extensively in the following way that I think is pretty clever, if I can pat myself on the back a little. Think about what population are you trying to satisfy if you're me, if you're a seed vendor or breeder. The general growing population, and I have like 40,000 followers on Instagram for Brothers Grimm. So if I have a new strain coming out, what I'll often do is take 100 packs and make them free to whoever wants them, that will grow them and report back to me and let me know how they did with them. And at the same time, I've already started some of the same seeds. So I'm gonna be listening to what these people say and comparing it to what I'm doing at home. Why am I doing that? I'm increasing the numbers of plants that I'm using for my test, right? And not only am I controlling for my own conditions, I'm allowing the general buying public. These are the same people who, if they buy them, are going to tell me they hate them, right? If they don't like them. So the best thing to do is let that population be the testers and get back to you on that, and then spend a year or 6 months or a reasonable amount of time getting feedback from folks that have grown the seeds. And if their results sound like your results and their pictures look like your pictures, then you know you've got a stable strain that actually performed as advertised and didn't have problems, or if it did, you shut the project down. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why the years and years that I've been doing this, and by the way, I got my start, as you probably read in the bio, coming out of college in the late 80s. I was just at that phase of life where I was sort of fooling around in a walk-in closet growing pot in college. And at that time, there was only 2 places that you could even buy seeds, and they were both in Amsterdam. One was called Super Sativa Seed Club, and the other one was the Seed Bank with Neville Schoenmaker. So I decided to buy my seeds from Super Sativa Seed Club, and I wrote a couple letters. Back in those days, there wasn't even email, remember? So it was just like me writing on a piece of paper and sending an envelope to Holland and hoping that the guy would answer me back in some reasonable amount of time. And he did that, the owner of the company, several times. And during the course of a year, we kind of developed a pen pal relationship where I graduated with my master's degree, got a job, and I was ready to go to Connecticut from New York and take on my new job. And at the same time, the seed company offers me a job to work for them too. It's best of both worlds. I get out and I'm actually working in my chosen field after getting my degree. And at night, moonlighting as a cannabis breeder. And so that's how it started, and it just developed over a long time. And so I've learned a lot of real science information and added a level of reliability or credibility to what's going on. I think because I come from a scientific background that I'm not believing in stuff like planting seeds by the moon cycles and, this fairy tale stuff. I stick to strictly science. It's that way. I can prove it, and here's why. So I'm based in reality, and I think that decades of doing it that way have made Brothers Grimm who we are today. And the best advertisement for my company always seems to be when people ask other breeders or other seed companies, should they do business with us? And they always say, oh yeah, they've been around a long time. And not only that, but quality product.
How many, let's say you did the pollination, how soon, how much would you say that strain is now stable?
No, it's not a number of cycles. It's just when you're talking about stability, you can be talking about 2 different things. You can be talking about the uniformity of the plants that are produced by the pack of seeds that you bought. That's one type of stability. The other type of stability is breeding stability, where when we breed these 2 plants together, like a true breeding strain would be one where from one batch of seeds, if you took a male and a female and you cross them together, you get the same plants again, like red petunias or carnations or something. You cross 2 red carnations and you get more red carnations, right? But hybrids don't work that way. Think about like those designer dogs they have nowadays. Like, what is it? Name one, somebody. A Labradoodle, right? You get a Labradoodle by crossing a poodle and a Labrador, right? But if you took 2 Labradoodles and crossed them together, would you get more Labradoodles? No. You might get a few that look like a Labradoodle, but you get a lot of variation as well. That's called an F2 generation, and that's where the recombination of genes starts to show more and more variation. And then from that generation, you may find your really super unique individual that you say, oh, wow, that's a special one, and so that can have value. But when you've already nailed it and you've got your Labradoodle, you don't want to experiment with Labradoodle to Labradoodle any further, right? So which stability you're talking about makes a difference. And numbers of cycles, I need to understand what you mean by cycles. Would you mean generations of crossing the plants together? Because the gentleman, I think, is referring to more like, has everyone been aware of a system that they call the filial generation system, where it's a F1, F2, F3, F4, and so on? Just because that number is higher doesn't mean that you've got a better quality than the previous generation or the one before that. Why? Because remember, each generation that you keep crossing together, if the parents weren't chosen intelligently and carefully, the result could be worse, not better, than the last generation, right? So those F numbers Don't let them fool you like somebody will say, this is an F6. Hey, well, so what? Maybe you messed it up from F3 on, you know? So none of that means anything without all the details. You need to know.
Prize F1, you know, people like trying to search those out to make sure that that's the case. But it's like, you know, and notoriously like the blue is heavy hermaphrodite.
You can get, it's possible, yeah. I mean, I have a stable Gorilla Glue that I've been growing for a while now that hasn't hermied on me, but I have heard that crosses of it will hermy, and so I will be watching for that. I have just crossed it to Cinderella, and so I have a Gorilla Glue Cindy cross that is just in a seedling stage right now that I'm doing some testing on. I think we have to call it an end now. The time is up, but you were a great audience. Yes, wonderful questions, and I hope this was informative and you're not leaving still wondering about something.